Somehow, while often sick, holding down a full-time job, a secular job, surrounded by domestic turmoil with an insane wife literally screaming from the next room, and his son's going berserk, tearing the place apart too, by the way, Carey mastered Bengali and Sanskrit, and by 1797, that's barely 5 years after he arrived there, the New Testament was translated into Bengali and ready for printing. Carey had also established several schools. He was preaching regularly in Bengali, but after 7 years of tireless toil in India, he still didn't have one single convert, not one. How's that for feeling a failure? Yeah. How did William Carey manage to maintain such a productive schedule while having to endure all those crushing disappointments, the endless distractions, the undeserved criticisms, the physical ailments and the heartbreaking tragedies, especially domestic tragedies? How did he manage to persevere and to keeping on without even encouragement of one single convert? To justify all his effort and all his sacrifice. To understand what motivated this most remarkable man, we need to look at what inspired him in the first place. One of the most influential sermons in church history was preached on the 31st of May, 1792 by William Carey in Northampton in England. And I've been to this very church, Carey Baptist Church in England. And this is what the town looks like today. And by the way, that's the house where he launched the Mission Society. It's still there. And we were able to go into the very place where they literally took up the first offering and got the church and the mission rolling. Carey's sermon literally sparked the greatest century of Christian advance. It marked the entry of the English-speaking world into missions. Since that time, English speakers have made up 80% of the Protestant missionary workforce, and that is absolutely extraordinary. In the last 220 years, English speakers have been 80% of the world's missionary force. Extraordinary. And all started with William Carey. And the text of his sermon was Isaiah 54, verse 2 to 3. Enlarge the place of your tent. Let them stretch out the curtains of your dwellings. Do not spare. Lengthen your cords. Strengthen your stakes. For you shall expand to the right and to the left. And your descendants will inherit the nations and make desolate cities inhabited. And on the base of this sermon, he made a theme summarized as expect great things from God. Attempt great things for God. Yet, riveting as the sermon was, the result was initially indecision. Carey was considered an enthusiast. That's the 18th century word for fanatic. He is an embarrassment because he had a bee in his bonnet about missions. And he kept bringing up missions and the heathen and evangelization. I mean, really, couldn't you just give it a break and do what everyone else was doing? But William Carey persisted until 5 months later, 12 Reformed Baptist ministers formed the Particular Calvinist Baptist Society for the Propagation of the Gospel amongst the Heathen. That's the title. And their first collection from these past amounted to £13, 2 shillings and 6pence. With that, they launched the greatest century of missions. What inspired Carey's landmark book? An inquiry into the obligation of Christians to use means for the conversion of the heathens, in which the religious states of the different nations of the world and the successes of former undertakings and the practicality of further undertakings are considered. It's a 42-word title. It's not the snappiest title in history, but it is the most important missions book ever produced. And by the way, Operation World acknowledges it as the first attempt to give a survey of what the world missionary situation was with statistics and so on. So in a way, Operation World is based upon this because this is the prototype. It's a prototype everything. But this prototype pioneer mission society was inspired by his eschatology of victory. Now you may wonder, what is that? Your eschatology is a view of the end times. William Carey was a post-millennialist. He wasn't like our premillennialists today, our dispensationalists, to say that everything's going to get worse and worse and worse and worse, and all these things are a sign of the end, and when everything's just about to fall to pieces, Jesus is going to pull the church out with the rapture, and he's going to pour out his judgment on the world, and 7 years later the Lord will return, and so on. He wasn't a premillennialist, he was a postmillennialist. He believed the Great Commission will be fulfilled before the return of Christ. And so his post-millennial view, his eschatology of victory, or Puritan hope as some call it, believed that God who gave us the Great Commission would enable us to fulfill the Great Commission. The work to which God has set his hands will infallibly prosper. We only want men and money to fill this country, India, with a knowledge of Christ. We are neither working at uncertainty, nor are we afraid for the result. Christ must reign until Satan has not 1 inch of territory left. But time and again, in the face of crushing defeats, disappointments, diseases, disasters, Carey reiterated his unwaveringly optimistic eschatology of victory. Though the superstitions of the heathen were 1,000 times worse than they are, an example of the Europeans 1,000 times worse, though I were deserted by all and persecuted by all, yet my faith, fixed on that sure word, would rise above all obstructions and overcome every trial, because God's cause will triumph. And Carey's faith was most certainly vindicated. The years of hard work and wholehearted sacrifice were graciously rewarded by God, and Carey's ministry literally transformed India. When Carey stepped ashore at Calcutta, 11th of November 1793, India was in a terribly degraded state. If an infant was sick, it was assumed he is under the influence of an evil spirit. The custom was to expose the sick infants to the elements, perhaps hang them up in a basket to either heat or cold outside. Near Mulder, Carey found the remains of a baby who had been offered as a sacrifice to be eaten alive by white ants. At the Sagar Mela, where the Ganges River flows in the sea, Carey witnessed how mothers would throw their own babies into the sea to drown or to be devoured by crocodiles. This the Hindus regard as a holy sacrifice to the mother Ganges. Carey undertook a thorough research into the numbers and the nature and the reasons for the infanticide, and he published his reports, and he presented several petitions to the government, until in 1802 infanticide was outlawed. Now this marked the first time that the British government had ever directly interfered with religious practice in India, and it set a precedent for the abolition of other evil practices. Hinduism had an extremely low view of women. It was often stated in Hinduism, there's no salvation for a woman until she's reborn as a man. See? Reincarnation. You've got to be reborn as a man before you've got a chance of salvation. Her only hope lay in serving men in complete subjection, without any individuality. Many female babies were smothered, strangled, or drowned at birth. Girls were married as young as 4 years old under Hinduism. Widows were perceived as bad omens who had brought about the deaths of their husbands. Widows were seen as an economic liability. Bereaved widows had to shave off all their hair, remove all their jewelry, forbidden to remarry, but were required to cohabit with her deceased husband's nearest male relative. Here's a widow who's been forced to mourn for 50 years, shaving off her hair and wearing unattractive clothes. Enormous pressure was put on them to actually go into the fire. Tremendous pressure for the widow to submit to sati, or immolation, to be burned alive in the funeral pyre of her husband, and in many cases they were forced to do it. There were times where they literally were holding them down with bamboo on all sides, so she's lying on an altar now. They're standing at the distance, people on both sides pushing the bamboo down so she couldn't get off, while the flames taking over. And amongst the weaver caste, or the Careys, widows were buried alive with a husband. So because of this Hindu practice of sati, children who had just lost their father would also lose their mother, and be orphaned at the same time. I mean, this is really evil. And the Hindu practice of polygamy compounded the problem, because a man might have many wives. On one occasion, Carey documented 33 wives burned alive on the funeral pyre of one man. On another occasion, an 11-year-old widow burned on the funeral pyre of her husband. Lepers were rejected by their families. Society rejected them, they were burned alive, believing that only a violent and fiery end could purify the body and ensure transmitigation into a healthy new existence. And then euthanasia was widely practiced with those afflicted by other sicknesses, putting them out to die amongst the elements. The infirmed were regularly carried out to be left exposed to cold or heat, crocodiles or insects by the riverside. Now it's important that you know all these things, because the amount of times you hear, you missionaries should leave the people alone, they're happy the way they are, they've got their own religion. And we had this Parliament of World Religions here in Cape Town, December 1999. And we had an obnoxious Hindu professor telling us how it is wrong to ever criticize any culture. Every culture is right and every culture is right. Every missionary is wrong when they try to change cultures, and missionaries shouldn't go and there shouldn't be any missionaries and we shouldn't ever try to get people to change their religions. And he carried on like this in this one workshop. One of our missionaries today, and he said during the question time, was William Carey wrong to oppose widow burning in India? Silence. This man stuttered, he stammered, it seemed like an age before he could get any answer out. And in the end, his answer was amazing. I couldn't believe that he said it. He said, well, widow burning didn't influence that many people. Well, a few 100,000, maybe a few million over thousands of years. How can you be so callous? It didn't influence that. One is too many, for goodness sakes. But this happened hundreds of thousands of times. How on earth can someone come up with such a callous response? But that was a professor who professed himself to be wise and definitely was a fool. Carey fought against all of these and many other evils, including child prostitution, slavery, and the caste system. He publicly criticized the government for inaction and passivity in the face of murder. He organized public debates. He spoke out against and wrote often on these atrocities. And they all met with official indifference. The Indian Supreme Court in 1805 ruled sati had religious sanction and therefore cannot be questioned. By the way, when I put out this article first as part of a Christian Action magazine, I got a response from some good friends who are evangelical missionaries who said, why did William Carey waste his time getting involved in these social and political issues? He should have concentrated on his missionary work. And I said, is there ever a person in the history of the world who's translated the Bible into more languages than William Carey? Has anyone done more? And the schools. And how can you say he didn't do enough? He did more than anyone else. But it just, you see, this is important to know. How far do we take a gospel application? Do we deal with these social evils, or do we just preach the gospel in the narrowest definition? Well, let's keep looking at William Carey's life. Carey established the first newspaper ever printed in an Oriental language, the Shamkar Darpan, an English language newspaper called Friends of India, which is still being published, by the way. Carey pioneered mass communication in India. The first mass communication in India ever was done by missionary William Carey. He also launched the social reform movement because he believed above all forms of truth and faith, Christianity seeks free discussion. We are not afraid of discussion and debate. We welcome it. Carey was the first man to stand up against the brutal murders and widespread oppression of women through female infanticide, through child marriage, through polygamy, through enforced female illiteracy, through widow burning, through forced euthanasia, and all these other evils. He conducted systematic research, published his writings, raised public protest in both Bengal and in England. He educated and influenced a whole generation of civil servants through his lectures at Fort William College. He was not just teaching them Oriental languages, you can be sure he was putting through morals and biblical principles. Serampore College and the Baptist Mission Press. He fought against the idea that a woman's life ceases to be valuable after her husband dies. He undermined the oppression and exploitation of women by providing women with education, which is a first in Asia, not just India. He opened the first schools for girls ever over there. Education was a major emphasis of his mission. In 1800, Carey was invited to lecture on Bengali, Sanskrit, Marathi at Fort William College. In 1806, they made him a professor, which was quite ironic, considering not only was he illegal as a missionary there at that time by English law, but he hadn't even finished junior school.